Floyd and Katoya, they was inseparable. You see her, you see him. You see him, you see her. I got there, they had it taped off, and then I heard this girl say, well, they say it's 2 people in there. I just got numb. I just couldn't believe that this happened, and I still don't.
The maintenance worker noticed that the back sliding glass was completely shattered. They did not respond to him. Both were cold to the touch.
The issue came up of who was actually the owner of the car.
He thought they were doing him wrong, so he wanted to do them wrong.
There was a very strong sense of family. When one called for help, the others came.
He wanted revenge. He wanted payback.
I can't believe this just happened right in front of my eyes.
11 a.m. on December 29th, 2020, in Kalamazoo, Michigan. A maintenance worker at the Oak Tree apartment complex makes his rounds for the day.
The maintenance worker was just kind of driving around, seeing if, it's just kind of a once through the apartment to see if there's anything. And he noticed that the back sliding glass door of the apartment number 1 there was completely shattered out. Obviously, it concerned him very much because this was an occupied apartment. It was a very cold time of year. This was in December.
He contacted his supervisor, who authorized him to go in and make sure everything was okay.
So he went up to the apartment and kind of, as maintenance does, he calls out multiple times just to see, hey, is there anybody home? As he's walking into the apartment, he's just, still being very cautious, just calling out because he doesn't want to, surprise anybody. Just as soon as you're in that hallway, you can see that bedroom, and you could see legs. He was on the bed, and he was clearly unresponsive. He kind of backed out right away. He obviously had a feeling that something was very, very wrong. So that maintenance worker contacted the manager, said, hey, something's going on. Can you please call the police? So that the actual manager of the complex contacted the police department.
A patrol officer with the Kalamazoo Police Department responds. He enters the apartment and heads toward the bedroom.
As he got into the bedroom, he observed a man on the bed and a woman up against the wall.
He discovered that there were 2 deceased individuals inside.
They're cold to the touch. A male victim and a female victim.
There was blood and injuries to the subjects. It was apparent that the subjects had gunshot wounds.
They located the identifications of driver's licenses of the 2 decedents and were able to identify them as Katoya McPherson and Floyd Brasher Jr.
"36-year-old Floyd Brashers Jr. was a Kalamazoo native.
Floyd was a happy baby. He didn't cry much. He walked at age 9 months. Floyd was an A student. He was on the honor roll. He was in the gifted class. He was real smart. Floyd, he loved sports. He was on a basketball team, he was on the football team, and he was on the volleyball team. He played exceptional basketball, and they just knew, he was real good.
In his teens, Floyd had a brief romance with Katoya McPherson.
They've been knowing each other for quite some time. We was close. She used to call me Mom.
The youthful romance ended when Floyd moved to Georgia with his mother.
He met another young lady that he had a relationship with, and he married her. She was a sweetheart. She was really a sweet girl. I liked her a lot.
Floyd had to be at least about 18 when he had his first child. He was just ecstatic. He was very proud to be a father. Like I say, he was very excited when he had his little girl. And then his son, I guess that just was the highlight of his life.
But the youthful marriage ended.
For some reason, unknown to me, they decided to go their separate ways. However, Floyd continued to stay active in his daughter's life and his son's life. He came back to Kalamazoo somewhere between 2009 and 10. Him and Katoya got back together. He still had feelings for her. Perhaps she still had feelings for him as well.
They met up again, and he moved in with her, and he had told me, he said, she has a little girl now. And he was thrilled about that. She would call my son Dad. And so they were a happy little couple. I was happy for him.
They were like two peas in a pod. They loved each other.
The couple struggled financially, but Floyd always opened his home and sometimes his wallet to those in need.
Floyd was too trusting. When it came to loaning people money, helping people, just certain people just took advantage of his kindness.
But keeping Katoya happy was always his first priority.
He couldn't go nowhere without Katoya. When he was with her, she had to go everywhere he went.
In December 2020, the couple took a trip north to visit Floyd's father just after Christmas.
I went to pick up my son and Katoya, both from the bus station here in Kalamazoo. They had went up for the holiday to visit his dad. And when they got back here, I picked them up from the bus station and took them home.
But the day after they returned, responding officers with the Kalamazoo Police Department find the couple dead inside their apartment.
They tape off the area. They want to make sure they get the perimeter secured, and they call the other investigators to check out the scene.
Homicide detectives arrive.
When detectives first checked the bedroom in which the victims were located, it appeared to be the main bedroom. Had the full-size bed and a TV in it. Laying face down on the bed was Mr. Brashers, and Miss McPherson was located slumped up against the wall just below the window. When looking at them, they were wearing what I would describe as clothes to sleep in. The fact that they were both in the bedroom, to me, seems like they were in the bedroom when whoever entered into the apartment.
They see that there's 7 shell casings around from a .32 caliber gun.
It appeared that once the victims were shot, where they fell is where they stayed.
Floyd Brasher was shot 5 times and Katoya McPherson was shot twice.
When you go into an apartment and the residents are deceased, it can be very difficult to ascertain if there's anything missing. Because, we as investigators don't know necessarily what was there and what may be missing. So initially, I wouldn't say there was any sign of robbery.
It appears the only thing the intruder was after was Floyd and Katoya.
The sliding glass door was shattered, but that was just how the suspects entered the apartment. I did not see things overturned. Someone broke into the house, ran into the house, shot them in their bedroom, and fled. Just from that very basic description, it seems like this was very targeted. They shot and killed both subjects. It wasn't one of them, it was both of them.
Four days after Christmas 2020, investigators in Kalamazoo, Michigan are at an apartment where 36-year-old Floyd Brashers Jr. and 33-year-old Katoya McPherson were shot to death in their bedroom. With few clues to be found inside the apartment, detectives look for witnesses.
We eventually spoke with the neighbor who lived in the apartment next to the victims. That neighbor indicated that in the previous evening, they had heard 6 or 7 gunshots.
Another neighbor was talked to, and they said they heard shots as well, about 6 to 7.
Both neighbors say the gunshots rang out shortly after 7 p.m.
Several officers observed houses that had exterior cameras. One of those houses was to the east of the location, and the camera pointed directly at the back of the apartment. So officers made contact with the homeowner to see if they could obtain video surveillance from that particular camera.
As detectives continue to work the scene, Floyd's family gets word of police activity at his apartment.
I received a phone call from my nephew, and he was crying and upset. He was saying, "You need to go see what's going on over there at Floyd and Katoya's." I got there. I'm looking at the crime scene. They had it taped off. And then I heard this girl say, "Well, they say it's 2 people in there." And I'm like, oh no. You know, I'm thinking, well, Floyd and Katoya, they, like I say, they was inseparable. You see her, you see him. You see him, you see her. So now I'm in tears. And sure enough, one of the officers, he come back and he said to me, he said, "We identify the body. Yes, it is. It's your son."
Meanwhile, detectives get word on the security cameras.
The system was a little older, and the camera footage, especially at night, was not clear, but we were able to obtain the video footage.
They check it around the time witnesses reported hearing the gunshots.
At 7:13:25, the 2 subjects are shown walking towards the apartment complex.
You could clearly see 2 silhouettes that ran up to the apartment.
One was taller, one was shorter. You see those 2 individuals go to the slider back door. They do something to the back door. You can't tell what it is.
At 7:13:47, the same 2 subjects are shown going inside.
About 9 seconds later, you see them both come out, and this time they're running across that area between the slider back door, and they disappear into those woods.
Then, an officer on the scene approaches detectives.
Sergeant White was quite adamant in letting us know that, hey, I had responded here multiple times yesterday.
Katoya McPherson and Floyd Brashers called the police the day before at 8:45.
Mr. Brashers had indicated that there were 2 individuals that had staying with them, that they wanted them out.
They called to get 2 people removed, D'Angelo Davis and Marcus Nichols. Marcus and D'Angelo were homeless, so Katoya and Floyd agreed to let them stay over the weekend. But the victim stated that the 2 gentlemen had overstayed their welcome, and they refused to leave.
When patrol officers arrived, they found D'Angelo furious, but not over being asked to leave.
There was a disagreement between Floyd Brashers and D'Angelo Davis, specifically about a missing vehicle.
D'Angelo was upset because he said they were lying about where his car was. They said it had gotten towed.
D'Angelo didn't believe the car was towed. Floyd told the officer it didn't matter. He explained that Katoya's stepsister bought the car from Floyd, promising to make payments. But before she paid it off, she sold it to D'Angelo.
She had purchased this vehicle from Floyd Brasher's, and that she was in the process of selling it to D'Angelo Davis. He still owed a certain amount of money on the vehicle, and she was still owed money to Floyd Brasher's.
Therefore, according to Floyd, the vehicle was legally his. At the urging of the officers, Marcus and D'Angelo left.
Now at this point, Marcus and D'Angelo are totally upset and frazzled. They grab their belongings and they leave, and they're picked up by a female.
The driver of the vehicle was D'Angelo's sister, Tanisha, and they did end up leaving the apartment complex.
But a couple of hours later, the officer says he was called back to the apartment. D'Angelo was there again, demanding that Floyd turn over the vehicle.
It was then that Mr. Brasher's presented an out-of-state title and saying, it was his vehicle. He then started saying, well, I have the keys, but the vehicle is hidden. He didn't want to tell Mr. Davis where the vehicle was.
The officers tells Davis that, look, this is a civil situation. You're gonna have to take this to civil court. Now Davis is getting even more upset and more infuriated. He feels like this is totally unfair because this is his vehicle and it is mine. However, still, there's nothing anyone can do.
The officer reports that the two men left. But now detectives are wondering, did they come back a third time?
I feel that it would be prudent to obviously follow up with them because of how upset he was and the fact that now they're dead, the next day.
Investigators working the homicide of Michigan couple Floyd Brasher's Jr. and Katoya McPherson want to question D'Angelo Davis over a dispute he had with the couple about a car.
We did have a phone number for D'Angelo Davis, so I drafted a search warrant, which could tell us within a small geographic area where that phone was at the time. I started receiving active locations for Mr. Davis. Due to the severity of the crime that we were investigating, a double murder, and the fact that Mr. Davis had previous firearm possession cases, it indicated that a more serious response was needed. It was determined that the Kalamazoo area Metro SWAT team would assist in arresting Mr. Davis. We were able to follow him for a short period of time and ended up making a stop on him on the east side of the city.
Almost a week after the shootings, D'Angelo Davis is taken into custody without incident.
After his arrest, he was taken to the Kalamazoo Township Police Department. The detective did ask him about what happened that day, or at least his whereabouts of that day. He stated that he had spent time with his family, specifically his sister Tanisha and his relative Trevor. We could verify some of that information because we knew for a fact that his sister had picked him up on the 28th.
Along with Marcus, D'Angelo says they left the apartment complex and tried to figure out where Floyd hid the car.
He had been driving around with the people in the car. Tanisha was driving the car, it's her vehicle, and they're driving around looking for the car.
But they couldn't find it.
Marcus was dropped off at his sister's residence, and from there, he claimed he spent the rest of the evening with his sister at his aunt's house.
Detective Sergeant Hayner did tell Mr. Davis that he, in fact, was a suspect in this case. And once he realized that he was a suspect in the case, requested an attorney. Due to the fact that Mr. Davis requested an attorney, Detective Sergeant Hayner no longer questioned him, and then he was transferred to the Kalamazoo County Sheriff's Department for his bond violation.
But D'Angelo doesn't remain in custody for long.
2 days later, D'Angelo Davis was released from jail.
With nothing else to go on, D'Angelo remains the only suspect. On January 7th, investigators reach out to Katoya's stepsister, Damania Johnson, the woman from whom D'Angelo said he bought the disputed car.
Damania told me that she had bought that car from Floyd. She had used the car and, she had sometimes driven D'Angelo Davis to work, but was in the process of selling that vehicle to D'Angelo Davis.
Their agreement was for D'Angelo to pay her $700.
When she first made the decision to sell the vehicle to D'Angelo, she said that she gave D'Angelo a ride and that his relative, Trevor, actually went with them. They went to the bank and Trevor's the actual one who took $500 out of the bank and gave it to her as like a down payment on the car. At the time of the incident, D'Angelo was 24 years old and Trevor was 17 years old. He also seemed to have a very strong influence on Trevor. She then said that D'Angelo also gave her several $100s as an additional payment on the car, but that he had still owed her some money on the car.
When D'Angelo stopped paying her, she stopped paying Floyd, prompting him to take back possession of the car the day before the shootings. She tells police D'Angelo was livid.
On the day before this incident occurred, he had called her multiple times to verify that he owned the vehicle. At that time, she didn't want to get involved, but he was messaging her multiple times. She could clearly tell that he was upset. And a big concern of hers was that he messaged her about, if they're going to put me through this, I'm going to be homeless.
He said if they don't give the car back, he would just be suffering, and he would make their life hell.
Kalamazoo detectives questioned Damania Johnson about murder suspect D'Angelo Davis. She tells investigators that he was furious over a botched car sale between himself and murder victims Floyd Brashers Jr. and Katoya McPherson.
She described him as kind of multiple terms, but a really good controlling person, manipulator, but also a mastermind. And going on with my interview with her, she said that D'Angelo and Trevor were very, very tight, and she had seen both of them with guns. We were understanding that there was possibly two suspects involved, Marcus Nichols O'Neal or D'Angelo Davis. So while they were persons of interest, this added an additional person of interest because she had brought up the fact that D'Angelo was very, very tight with his brother Trevor, and that she had seen both of them with firearms previously. We decided we'd go and find Marcus Nichols O'Neal. We had several addresses for him, and after checking several addresses, we located him and asked him to come speak with us, and he voluntarily came to the Kalamazoo Township Police Department. We started talking to him about the incidents of that day. We knew that he was with D'Angelo in the morning, so we just began talking to him about the day, what he did, where he went, things like that.
He admits that he and D'Angelo did go back to the apartment for a third time, around 7 p.m.
In fact, he specifically said Tanisha drove him and D'Angelo Davis to the apartment complex.
He says they parked in the lot of another complex connected to the one where Floyd lived by way of a wooded path.
Marcus stated that they approached the home through the woods.
Then he talks about breaking in the back window.
He admits that he was the one that broke the window in Katoya and Floyd's home, but he can't remember what weapon he used. He didn't know if it was a bat or a rock or what.
He's going back and forth, but then later says it's a bat. He then describes going into the apartment. And this is where some of the information that someone with intimate knowledge of the crime would know.
he also correctly stated what kind of caliber gun was used in the shooting.
He knows the caliber of the firearm used, which, again, you would only know that a .32 caliber firearm was used. It's not a typical caliber.
But as he goes on, detectives note that Marcus starts to get hung up on the details.
We talked to him about where the victims were, and his statement was that he thought one of the victims was in the kitchen. Now we know from the scene that nothing happened in the kitchen. And we start talking to him about how many gunshots were fired. He says 2. He sticks to that number. We know that's not accurate.
He later admitted that D'Angelo was the one that fired the gun during an argument with Katoya and Floyd.
He stated that after shooting them, they then fled the scene and were then picked up by Tanisha. He believed that D'Angelo discarded the firearm somewhere in the woods. He talks about how he's shocked and just so surprised about what happened. He said that D'Angelo told him they were going over there to just get the car or find out where the car was, so he didn't expect there to be such violence and to have, Katoya and Floyd killed.
But detectives are troubled by Marcus's confession.
We did have concerns because some of the statements did not line up with the evidence that we had and had established. But at the same time, the statements were of such detail that we couldn't just put those discrepancies aside.
There is one part of Marcus's statement that police want to look into right away.
Specifically that Tanisha had driven them to and from the scene. And we also knew Tanisha had picked D'Angelo up and returned him to the apartment when earlier on the 28th, when they were still determining ownership of the vehicle. So we knew for sure that that made sense. So we went and found Tanisha at her place of employment. She said on the 28th, after picking up her brother, they had contacted multiple towing companies and couldn't find the vehicle. She said that she drove D'Angelo around town for quite some time in an attempt to find the vehicle.
But Tanisha says she never went back to the apartment with her brother that night. Detectives think she is lying.
She was reluctant to speak about the incident, obviously because she was talking about her family. We confronted her with the fact that we had information that she drove her brother to the scene. Once we confronted Tanisha about the fact we knew that she had driven D'Angelo to the scene, she started to admit to what she knew about that evening. When we talked to her about Marcus Nichols O'Neal, she said that they had dropped him off earlier in the night and that he was not involved, and that the only people in that vehicle were her, D'Angelo, and Trevor. She was very clear.
Homicide detectives in Kalamazoo, Michigan, are questioning Tanisha Taylor McMillan about the shooting deaths of Floyd Brashers Jr. and Katoya McPherson. Tanisha tells them that confessed accomplice Marcus Nichols O'Neal wasn't even there. Instead, it was her, D'Angelo, and their younger relative, Trevor.
She admits to driving D'Angelo Davis and Trevor Moore to an apartment complex near the victim's home.
Now, she was saying that she did not know at this point what they were planning on doing other than going over there. She did not say she saw a weapon or a firearm. She said that they took a bat that she keeps in her vehicle for personal protection.
According to Tanisha, Trevor and D'Angelo got out of the car and headed down the path toward Floyd's apartment.
It wasn't very long from how long it took from when they left the vehicle to when they came back. I think it was just a matter of minutes.
And she says when they got back that Mr. Davis made statements about emptying a clip. Davis immediately told her to get out of there. She believed that they were going there to get the car back and only found out that the two had been killed after the fact.
So when they asked Tanisha who does she think pulled the trigger, she stated D'Angelo because he had the temperament, the energy, and the excitement, and he had a motive to do it. According to Tanisha, the real motive for the killing was D'Angelo was upset and wanted payback.
Tanisha is arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Meanwhile, Marcus is released.
Marcus had a brief conversation with the officers, and they asked about his false claim of being there. And he said, you know what? I have no idea why. Sometimes my brain gives me false conclusions.
Through statements given to him by Trevor and D'Angelo, for some reason, put himself at the scene in Trevor's shoes. And that is why he had so many incorrect statements about the facts in the case.
But D'Angelo remains free.
Subsequent contacts with D'Angelo Davis occurred following the arrest of Tanisha, his sister. During these contacts, D'Angelo didn't openly admit to his involvement in the crime. However, he showed a great deal of concern and remorse that his sister had been caught up in the investigation. That seemed to be his singular focus.
On March 29, 2021, D'Angelo reaches out, wanting to take some of the heat off his sister, Tanisha.
D'Angelo stated that he came forward because his sister thought he abandoned her, and he wanted to show her that he would never do that. He told the detectives that he did it all. He had the bat, he broke into the window, he was the shooter. He did the entire thing himself.
He then changed that statement, and he told him next that Trevor had the baseball bat, but that he was the person who shot Floyd Brashes Jr. and Katoya McPherson.
Detectives were able to tell D'Angelo was lying. On the surveillance footage, it was shown that the taller of the two men were the one that actually broke the window and went in first. And as they compare the heights of the two individuals, D'Angelo was taller, so obviously he is the one that went in first.
So when confronted, D'Angelo Davis then changes his story, and he indicates that he had the baseball bat and that he's the one who broke out the slider, that when they entered, Trevor had the gun, and Trevor was the one who shot and killed both Katoya McPherson and Floyd Brashes.
D'Angelo hit Floyd in the legs so he could not get up. D'Angelo said Trevor shot Katoya first, then Floyd. He brought the bat back to his aunt's house and discarded it near a basketball court. Trevor sold the gun a few days later after the murders.
According to D'Angelo, the murders were about respect.
D'Angelo felt very disrespected by what happened to the vehicle. He thought they were doing him wrong, so he wanted to do them wrong.
D'Angelo Davis is charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. 2 weeks later, Trevor Moore is found.
On April 19, 2021, I was notified that Trevor had been located in a nearby county and had been taken into custody on an unrelated incident.
When Trevor was asked, did he do the murder for the family ties, he said, the family ties ain't that strong. Then he concluded the interview.
He is charged with 2 counts of felony murder. One is for Katoya McPherson, and the other is for Floyd Brashes.
As the trials near, prosecutors approach Tanisha.
Ultimately, we made an offer to her that if she pled guilty to being an accessory after the fact to murder, that the other charges would be dismissed. The other part of the plea agreement is that she agreed as part of the agreement to testify truthfully in cases involving the death of the two decedents and DeAngelo Davis and Trevor.
But then DeAngelo's attorney reaches out. He also wants a deal.
DeAngelo was offered a plea deal of second-degree murder if he would have testified against Trevor Moore.
DeAngelo took the deal. However, that deal was dependent on him testifying during the trial.
In March 2022, Trevor Moore goes on trial for the 2020 shooting deaths of Floyd Brashers Jr. and Katoya McPherson.
At the time these murders happened, he was 17, and he ended up being tried as an adult. He was 18 during the time of the trial.
Two of his close relatives, DeAngelo Davis and Tanisha Taylor McMillan, have taken deals in exchange for their promise to testify against him. But at the start of the trial, DeAngelo has a change of heart.
I show up to trial the second day of trial, and that's when I'm informed by his attorney that he's going to assert his right to remain silent.
And that kind of disrupted the prosecutor's flow and theory of the trial, because they had talked a lot about what DeAngelo Davis was going to say during the trial.
DeAngelo's refusal to testify caused a mistrial in Trevor's case in March of 2022.
Having refused to testify against Trevor, in June of 2022, DeAngelo Davis must now go on trial himself.
When we went into that trial, his confession to the police was the cornerstone of the case.
Even though DeAngelo said Trevor was the trigger man, the prosecution paints him as the mastermind and the man with the motive.
Part of the argument that I made to the jury is under Michigan law, there is aiding and abetting in a case. So I believe the evidence showed that DeAngelo Davis aided and abetted in the homicide.
The police officers testifying about the incident that happened the day before, DeAngelo being very upset, being forced off the property by the police. This was his deal. This was his problem he had with these people. This is something that started because of him.
He's the one that directed where the trio went that day. So he was, I believe, the driving force behind each of the two murders. There was a very strong sense of family between the three of them. So when one called for help, the others came. And I think that that was a dynamic at play on the 28th of December 2020, that DeAngelo called first Tanisha for help and then Trevor for help, and that no small part based on that family dynamic, they came to assist him.
DeAngelo got found guilty of first-degree murder, got sentenced to life in prison.
That September, Trevor goes on trial again. The defense has the advantage.
Tanisha did testify about the murders, and she did implicate both DeAngelo and Trevor.
But it isn't enough.
The jury.
On the morning of August 13, 2018, the neighborhood looked exactly the way people imagine safety should look. Wide streets stretched beneath a pale Colorado sky. Freshly cut lawns lined the sidewalks. American flags hung quietly from front porches, barely moving in the warm summer air. Garage doors opened one after another as parents prepared for work, children rode bicycles before school, and sprinklers painted tiny rainbows across emerald grass. Nothing about Saratoga Trail suggested that history was about to remember it. Nothing hinted that behind one of those identical suburban walls, an entire family had already vanished. If someone had driven slowly through that neighborhood just after sunrise, they might have noticed only one unusual thing. A white work truck sat in a driveway much earlier than usual. Its engine had started before dawn. It had pulled away while most of the street was still asleep. It would later become one of the most important pieces of evidence in one of America's most disturbing family murder cases. But no one knew that yet. To everyone watching from the outside, this was simply another Monday. Just another ordinary morning. Just another husband waiting for his wife to come home. Or so it seemed. Only hours later, television cameras would capture a soft-spoken father standing in front of that very house. His arms folded across his chest. His voice calm. His expression strangely controlled. He looked directly into the camera and pleaded for the safe return of his pregnant wife and 2 little daughters. Millions of people would watch those images. Some would feel sympathy. Others would feel something they couldn't quite explain. There was something unsettling about the silence between his words. Something almost rehearsed. Something that didn't fit the panic expected from a husband whose entire family had disappeared without a trace. At that moment, nobody could prove he was lying. Yet experienced investigators often describe a strange feeling that arrives before evidence does. Facts come later. Physical evidence comes later. Confessions come later. But sometimes instinct quietly knocks first. Within days, that instinct would prove devastatingly accurate. The truth hiding behind the smiling family photographs was darker than anyone could have imagined. This wasn't the story of a stranger breaking into a home. It wasn't a kidnapping. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong. The danger had been sleeping inside the house all along. Long before the police tape surrounded the property. Long before helicopters circled overhead. Long before forensic teams searched an isolated oil field beneath the scorching Colorado sun. 3 innocent lives, and the life of an unborn baby, had already been stolen by the person who should have protected them most. The tragedy shocked the entire world not only because of its brutality, but because it shattered one of society's deepest assumptions. People often fear monsters hiding in dark alleys. They fear masked intruders, serial killers, unknown faces. But some of the most horrifying crimes begin in kitchens where families eat dinner together. In bedrooms decorated with wedding photographs. In living rooms filled with children's toys. Places where love is supposed to live. The Watts family seemed to represent the modern American dream. A beautiful home. 2 smiling little girls. A baby on the way. Vacation photos. Birthday celebrations. Holiday decorations. Videos full of laughter uploaded to social media for friends and relatives to see. From the outside, everything appeared almost picture perfect. That illusion would soon collapse with breathtaking speed. As investigators slowly peeled away each layer, the image that emerged was not simply one of murder. It became a portrait of deception. Of hidden resentments. Of financial pressure. Of emotional distance growing quietly beneath carefully maintained smiles. And of a man who continued acting like an ordinary husband while, according to his later confession, carrying secrets almost impossible to comprehend. Yet this story is not ultimately about him. It is about the lives that ended before they had the chance to continue. A mother who believed she was building a future for her family. 2 little girls whose laughter filled the rooms of their home only days before. An unborn child who would never take his first breath. The public often remembers the name of the killer first. True justice demands remembering the victims first. Because behind every headline, every documentary, every courtroom photograph, there were birthdays that would never be celebrated, family traditions that would never continue, empty bedrooms that would never again echo with tiny footsteps. There were grandparents waiting for phone calls that would never come. Friends refreshing their phones again and again, wondering why messages remained unread. Neighbors staring at a quiet house, unable to imagine the nightmare concealed behind its front door. In the hours before anyone realized something was terribly wrong, life continued everywhere else. Children climbed onto school buses. Coffee shops opened. Traffic filled the highways leading into Denver. Office lights flickered on. The world kept moving, completely unaware that one family had already disappeared from it. It is often said that every crime scene tells a story. Sometimes it speaks through fingerprints. Sometimes through DNA. sometimes through surveillance footage. This crime scene spoke through absence. A purse left behind. Medication untouched. Shoes still inside the house. Blankets missing from children's beds. Silence where voices should have been. Investigators would soon discover that silence can be as revealing as blood. Because when someone plans to leave forever, they usually take pieces of their life with them. When everything important is left behind, detectives begin asking different questions. Questions that become harder and harder to answer honestly. Those questions would eventually point toward the one person who appeared most eager to help. The husband. The father. The man giving television interviews. The man standing calmly in his own driveway. The man asking strangers to help bring his family home. As investigators examined surveillance footage frame by frame, interviewed neighbors, reviewed phone records, and reconstructed the final hours before the disappearance, a chilling picture slowly emerged. Not all lies sound dramatic. Some are spoken quietly. Some are hidden behind polite smiles. Some are delivered with remarkable confidence. But lies have a difficult relationship with time. The longer they survive, the more fragile they become. Eventually, they begin collapsing under the weight of ordinary facts. A security camera. A missed appointment. A forgotten text message. A neighbor's observation. A single inconsistency. Then another. And another. Until the truth has nowhere left to hide. This case would become one of the most intensely examined criminal investigations of the 21st century. Not because it involved an elaborate conspiracy. Not because investigators spent years chasing an unknown suspect. But because the answer stood in plain sight almost from the beginning, hidden behind the familiar face of someone everyone believed they knew. The hardest part of this story is not understanding how detectives solved the crime. The hardest part is confronting the unsettling reality that ordinary appearances can conceal extraordinary darkness. That evil does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it wears a wedding ring. Sometimes it kisses its children goodnight. Sometimes it smiles for family photographs only days before everything falls apart. Before we examine the investigation, before we follow the evidence from a quiet suburban neighborhood to an isolated oil site, before courtroom confessions replace public denials, we have to return to the beginning. Because every tragedy has a moment when life still seems normal. A final evening when tomorrow feels guaranteed. A last family photograph that no one realizes will become a memorial. A final hug. A final bedtime. A final drive home. For the Watts family, that moment arrived on an August night in 2018. No one watching from the outside could have imagined that by sunrise, an ordinary family home would become the center of one of the most haunting true crime cases in modern American history. There is a question that echoes through nearly every case involving violence inside a family home. It is not how the crime happened. Investigators can often answer that through evidence. It is not even who committed it. Given enough time, the truth usually finds a way to the surface. The question that lingers far longer is far more unsettling. How can someone wake up beside the people they claim to love? And, within a matter of hours, become the reason those lives come to an end? No stranger forced open the front door of the Watts home that August morning. No alarm shattered the silence before dawn. There was no desperate 911 call reporting an intruder. No neighbors heard the kind of chaos usually associated with unimaginable violence. The house remained quiet. So quiet, in fact, that the neighborhood continued sleeping while events unfolded that would later horrify millions of people around the world. Silence has a peculiar way of disguising catastrophe. From the outside, silence looks peaceful. It looks harmless. It suggests that everything is exactly as it should be. Yet in some homes, silence is not the absence of conflict. It is what remains after conflict has been hidden for so long that no one outside can recognize it anymore. The Watts case forced people to confront an uncomfortable reality. Happiness is easy to display. Social media photographs capture smiles. Videos preserve laughter. Family vacations become carefully edited highlights. Birthday parties, holiday dinners, and children's milestones are shared with friends and strangers alike. But cameras rarely capture financial stress. They do not record sleepless nights spent worrying about debt. They cannot reveal conversations that stop the moment someone walks into the room. Most importantly, they cannot expose resentment quietly growing behind closed doors. The image presented to the world can become so convincing that even those living inside it begin trying to believe it. For years, the Watts family appeared to embody the promise of suburban success. Their home stood among dozens of others that looked almost interchangeable, each one representing stability, routine, and ordinary life. Children played nearby. Neighbors waved as they passed. Weekends brought backyard gatherings and family outings. It was the kind of place where people expected to grow old, not the kind of place investigators would someday search inch by inch. Yet history repeatedly reminds us that some of the most devastating crimes occur in places that seem incapable of producing them. That contradiction is part of what made this case impossible to ignore. The public searched desperately for a warning sign. Surely there had to be one. Surely someone must have seen something. A burst of anger. A violent history. A police record. Anything that could explain how an apparently devoted father became the central figure in such an unthinkable tragedy. Instead, they found something far more disturbing. Ordinariness. Co-workers described a man who appeared quiet and dependable. Neighbors recalled routine conversations across driveways and sidewalks. Friends saw a husband who participated in family life and rarely drew attention to himself. Nothing about those surface impressions prepared anyone for what investigators would eventually uncover. Perhaps that is why this case continues to resonate years later. It challenges a comforting belief that danger always announces itself. Sometimes it does not. Sometimes it blends into everyday routines so completely that no one notices until it is too late. As the investigation unfolded, every ordinary object inside the Watts home seemed to acquire a different meaning. A child's blanket. Family photographs hanging neatly on the wall. A pair of tiny shoes waiting near the front door. Each item became a painful reminder that a normal morning had been interrupted forever. Investigators would later examine these ordinary details with extraordinary care, because crime scenes are often built from things that seem insignificant at first glance. A misplaced object. An unopened prescription. A vehicle leaving at an unusual hour. Small details begin forming patterns, and patterns begin revealing truths that people desperately hoped were impossible. But in those first hours, none of that was yet visible. There was only uncertainty. A pregnant woman had stopped answering her phone. 2 little girls could not be found. A husband claimed he had no idea where they had gone. Friends began calling. Family members became increasingly worried. Every passing hour transformed concern into fear. It is difficult to appreciate how quickly an ordinary missing person case can evolve into something far darker. At first, hope tends to dominate every conversation. Perhaps she went to stay with a friend. Perhaps there had been an argument. Perhaps her phone battery had died. People instinctively search for explanations that allow the story to return to normal. Hope resists surrender. It searches for reasons. It bargains with uncertainty. It clings to possibilities, even when the evidence quietly begins pointing elsewhere. That emotional journey would be experienced not only by investigators, but also by relatives, friends, and millions of strangers following the case from their living rooms. Each new development seemed to narrow the path toward only one unbearable conclusion. And yet, throughout those crucial early hours, one person remained at the center of the unfolding mystery. Chris Watts. The husband. The father. The last known adult believed to have seen the family alive. At first glance, his role appeared straightforward. He was the worried spouse cooperating with authorities. He answered questions. He spoke with detectives. He allowed officers into the home. He appealed to the public through television interviews. Everything about his actions suggested someone searching for answers alongside everyone else. Appearances, however, can be profoundly deceptive. As detectives continued asking routine questions, subtle inconsistencies began emerging. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that alone proved guilt. But experienced investigators understand that truth usually remains consistent, while fabricated stories often require constant adjustment. Tiny details shifted. Timelines became uncertain. Explanations lacked the emotional weight expected under such extraordinary circumstances. Individually, these observations meant very little. Together, they began forming the outline of a much larger picture. That picture would eventually reveal not only what happened inside the Watts home, but also how easily perception can be manipulated by familiarity. The case soon expanded beyond a missing family investigation. It became an examination of trust itself. How well do we truly know the people closest to us? How much of another person's internal life remains invisible, even to spouses, relatives, co-workers, and lifelong friends? Those questions have no simple answers, but they haunt nearly every family homicide investigation. Because betrayal always cuts deeper when it comes from within. Violence committed by strangers is terrifying. Violence committed by someone entrusted with love and protection reshapes the meaning of safety itself. For the investigators assigned to this case, emotion had to remain secondary to evidence. Every interview, every surveillance recording, every digital record, every forensic examination would have to withstand scrutiny in court. Assumptions were dangerous. Sympathy could not replace facts. Suspicion alone could not become proof. The evidence would have to speak. And eventually, it would. Piece by piece. Frame by frame. Minute by minute. Until the final hours of the Watts family could be reconstructed with heartbreaking clarity. But before that reconstruction was possible, detectives first had to understand who this family had been before everything unraveled. They needed to look beyond headlines and police reports, beyond viral news clips and courtroom testimony, and return to a time when the future still seemed full of ordinary plans. Who was Shanann Watts beyond the photographs shared online? Who were Bella and Celeste beyond the smiling faces that would soon appear across television screens around the world? What kind of life had they built together? And perhaps most importantly, when did the distance between appearance and reality become so vast that it could no longer be hidden? Those answers do not begin at the crime scene. They begin months earlier, inside a family that believed tomorrow would arrive just like every other day. The deeper we look into this case, the clearer one truth becomes. Some stories begin with violence. Others begin with hope. This one began with hope. And that is precisely what makes everything that followed so devastating. The story you are about to hear is built from police reports, court records, documented evidence, surveillance footage, digital data, and the statements made throughout the investigation. Some questions surrounding the emotional dynamics inside the family have inspired years of public discussion, but wherever certainty ends, speculation begins. Throughout this story, we will remain grounded in what investigators were able to establish, while acknowledging that no reconstruction can fully capture the private moments that disappeared forever with the people who lived them. That distinction matters. Because true crime is not simply about recounting violence. It is about understanding how ordinary lives become extraordinary tragedies without allowing imagination to replace fact. In the years since August 2018, countless documentaries, books, podcasts, and online discussions have revisited the Watts case. Millions of viewers have analyzed interviews frame by frame. Behavioral experts have debated body language. Internet forums have examined facial expressions, pauses in conversation, and individual words spoken during television appearances. Some theories have been supported by evidence. Many have not. When a case captures worldwide attention, speculation often grows faster than verified information. The challenge is separating what is known from what is merely believed. Because behind every viral headline stood a real family whose lives cannot be reduced to internet theories. A mother. 2 little girls. An unborn son. Their story deserves more than shock value. It deserves patience. It deserves accuracy. And above all, it deserves humanity. There is another reason this case continues to fascinate investigators and psychologists alike. Unlike many notorious criminal cases, this one unfolded in astonishingly little time. The disappearance was reported on August 13th. Within days, investigators had shifted their attention toward the husband. Within an even shorter period, the case moved from uncertainty to confession. Compared with investigations that remain unsolved for years, the timeline here was remarkably compressed. Yet the emotional impact has endured for far longer than the investigation itself. That endurance comes from a simple but disturbing realization. Nothing about the family, at least from the outside, seemed destined for such an ending. If you looked only at photographs, you would see vacations, birthday cakes, Halloween costumes, Christmas mornings, children laughing as they chased bubbles across a backyard, parents smiling beside them. Images like these exist in millions of family albums across the world. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility. How many other lives look perfectly ordinary from the outside while carrying invisible burdens behind closed doors? Most never descend into violence. Some do. Understanding why remains one of the greatest challenges in criminal psychology. Investigators can identify motives. Courts can determine guilt. Experts can examine personality, relationships, financial pressures, and behavioral changes. Yet even after every document has been filed and every sentence has been imposed, one question often survives. Why this choice? Why this moment? Why this family? The legal system answers what happened. Human nature keeps asking why. As this story unfolds, you may find yourself searching for the precise instant everything changed. Perhaps it was a decision made months earlier. Perhaps a relationship that should never have begun. Perhaps pressures that accumulated slowly over years. Or perhaps there was no single turning point at all, only a gradual erosion of honesty until reality itself became impossible to sustain. The evidence offers pieces of that puzzle. It does not answer every question. And perhaps it never will. Some parts of this case remain locked inside the mind of the only surviving adult who knows exactly what happened during those final hours. Even his own accounts changed over time. Investigators compared each version carefully against physical evidence, witness testimony, digital records, and forensic findings. Where statements conflicted with established facts, they relied on evidence rather than narrative. That method transformed uncertainty into a case capable of standing before a court of law. It is a reminder that truth rarely emerges all at once. It arrives in fragments. A timestamp. A surveillance recording. A phone notification. A footprint. A conversation remembered slightly differently by different people. Each fragment appears insignificant until it joins another. Then another. Eventually, a complete picture begins to emerge. That process lies at the heart of every homicide investigation. Not dramatic intuition. Not cinematic breakthroughs. But disciplined attention to details that refuse to disappear. In this case, those details would accumulate with remarkable speed. The driveway. The neighbor's security camera. The work truck. The remote oil site. The unanswered phone. The missing family. Each one became another thread leading investigators toward a truth almost too painful to accept. Yet before detectives followed those threads, there was still a family living what appeared to be an ordinary life. There were plans for the future. There were conversations about a new baby. There were routines repeated so often they probably seemed permanent. No one wakes up expecting to be remembered through evidence photographs. No child falls asleep believing her bedroom will soon become part of a criminal investigation. Life almost always feels unfinished because it is supposed to continue. That is what makes sudden violence so profoundly difficult to comprehend. It interrupts not only lives, but expectations. The expectation of tomorrow. Of birthdays yet to come. Of school mornings. Of family dinners. Of growing older together. Every homicide creates two timelines. One is the timeline that actually happened. The other is the future that never had the chance to exist. In the Watts case, that second timeline was especially heartbreaking. It included the birth of a little boy who would never enter the world. It included two sisters who would never begin school together. It included grandparents who would never meet the child they had already begun to imagine. Those futures disappeared long before anyone realized they were in danger. Perhaps that is the greatest tragedy hidden beneath the headlines. Not only what was taken, but everything that could have been. As we move deeper into this story, it is important to remember that true crime should never become entertainment detached from consequence. Every piece of evidence represents a real moment lived by real people. Every courtroom exhibit once belonged to someone's everyday life. Every photograph introduced before a jury captured memories that families never expected strangers to examine. The responsibility of telling this story is therefore not to sensationalize suffering, but to understand it. To follow the evidence honestly. To recognize the victims as people before they became headlines. And to examine how one of the most shocking family murders in modern American history unfolded step by step, until there was no room left for denial. Because once the investigation truly began, the carefully constructed image surrounding the Watts family would begin to crack. Behind every unanswered phone call. Behind every reassuring smile. Behind every public appeal. There was a reality waiting to be uncovered. And once that reality emerged, it would leave investigators, the victims' loved ones, and an entire nation confronting a question that still lingers today. How could a home that looked so full of life become the setting for such unimaginable loss? To answer that, we have to go back to the beginning, before the headlines, before the police cars, before the television cameras gathered outside a quiet house in Frederick, Colorado. We have to meet the family as they were known before the world learned their names. In the summer of 2018, Frederick, Colorado, was the kind of place people chose when they wanted distance from the noise without giving up the conveniences of a growing city. Located roughly 30 miles north of Denver, the town had expanded rapidly over the previous decade. New housing developments spread across what had once been open fields, attracting young families looking for larger homes, quieter streets, and the promise of a stable community. On weekday mornings, commuters filled the highways before sunrise, while children waited for school buses beneath an endless western sky. It was a place where neighbors recognized one another's cars, where weekend barbecues were common, and where the rhythm of everyday life followed familiar patterns. Among those neighborhoods was Saratoga Trail, a subdivision lined with nearly identical two-story homes. The streets curved gently through rows of recently built houses, each with carefully maintained lawns, concrete driveways, and small trees that had only begun to mature. It was not a wealthy enclave hidden behind gates, nor was it an area associated with crime. Instead, it reflected a distinctly modern version of suburban America, where families invested in homes large enough to imagine decades of birthdays, graduations, and holiday gatherings. One of those homes stood at 2825 Saratoga Trail. To passers-by, it blended almost seamlessly into the neighborhood. The exterior offered little reason to linger. Large windows faced the street. A covered front porch welcomed visitors. The garage occupied much of the front facade, like many contemporary suburban homes. Nothing about the property suggested that it would one day become one of the most recognizable addresses in modern American true crime. Inside lived Chris Watts, his wife Shannon Watts, and their two daughters, Bella and Celeste, who was affectionately known as CECE. By the summer of 2018, the family was also preparing to welcome another child. Shannon was approximately 15 weeks pregnant with a baby boy they planned to name Nico. Friends and relatives knew the pregnancy as a joyful milestone, another chapter in what appeared to be a growing family determined to move forward despite life's ordinary challenges. From the outside, they seemed to represent a familiar version of the American dream. There was a spacious home. 2 energetic young children. Parents who both worked. Plans for the future. Photographs of birthdays, vacations, and family celebrations. Like millions of other families, much of their daily life unfolded online. Shannon, in particular, maintained an active presence on social media. She frequently shared videos and photographs documenting family milestones, holidays, everyday routines, and her work promoting health and lifestyle products through a multi-level marketing company. Those posts offered relatives and friends, many of whom lived far away, a window into family life. Years later, those same videos would take on an entirely different meaning. Viewers who returned to them after the murders searched for clues that no one could have recognized at the time. A glance. A pause. A brief exchange. Yet hindsight often creates patterns invisible in the moment. Investigators relied not on internet speculation but on evidence that could be independently verified. Social media became one piece of the larger picture, illustrating how the family presented themselves publicly, but it did not tell the whole story. Like many households, the Watts family navigated pressures that remained largely private. Financial records later introduced during the investigation showed that the family had experienced significant financial strain. They had previously filed for bankruptcy, and although they continued working to rebuild their finances, money remained a source of stress. Mortgage payments, household expenses, childcare costs, and everyday obligations formed part of the reality behind the carefully curated snapshots shared online. Financial hardship, however, is common and, by itself, cannot explain an act of violence. Investigators considered it as one factor among many rather than a single cause. Chris Watts worked for Anadarko Petroleum, an energy company operating oil and gas facilities throughout Colorado. His position required him to travel to remote well sites, often beginning work early in the morning. Co-workers generally described him as quiet and dependable. He was not known for seeking attention, and those who interacted with him professionally often characterized him as reserved rather than outspoken. His routine contrasted with Shannan's more public-facing lifestyle. Shannan had built much of her work around communication and online engagement. She documented family activities, shared motivational messages, and remained active within a network of colleagues and customers. Friends described her as energetic, organized, and deeply invested in her family. She also spoke openly about personal challenges, including health issues she had experienced in previous years. Rather than hiding those experiences, she often used them to encourage others facing similar struggles. The differences in their personalities were visible even to casual observers. Chris appeared comfortable staying in the background. Shannan often occupied the center of the camera's frame. Neither characteristic was inherently unusual. Many successful relationships involve partners with very different temperaments. Yet those differences contributed to the public image many people developed of the family. To outsiders, they seemed to balance one another, creating a household that, while busy, appeared stable. The children naturally became the emotional center of that image. Bella, the older sister, was often described by family members as thoughtful and gentle. Cece, younger by a year, was remembered as energetic and expressive. Videos shared by Shannan captured ordinary childhood moments, playing games, celebrating birthdays, laughing together around the house. Those recordings would later become deeply painful reminders of lives interrupted far too soon. By the middle of 2018, another important development had entered the family's plans. Shannan was expecting a son. The pregnancy represented not only the arrival of another child but also what appeared to be another opportunity for the family to move forward together. Publicly, the announcement was met with excitement from relatives and friends. The unborn baby, later identified in court records as Nico, became an enduring reminder that the tragedy claimed 4 lives rather than 3. As summer progressed, daily routines continued much as they always had. Chris left for work before sunrise. Shannan balanced childcare, household responsibilities, business activities, and medical appointments related to her pregnancy. Bella and Cece filled the home with the unpredictable energy familiar to parents of young children. On the surface, life appeared remarkably ordinary. Yet investigators would later reconstruct a different picture emerging beneath those routines. Evidence gathered from digital communications showed that the marriage had entered a period of increasing strain. While many of the family's interactions remained affectionate, messages exchanged in the weeks leading up to August revealed growing concerns about the relationship. Those concerns did not exist in isolation. During the investigation, Detectives also learned that Chris had begun a relationship with a coworker. That relationship would become an important element in understanding the timeline investigators ultimately established, although motive itself would remain more complex than any single circumstance. The contrast between public appearance and private reality would become one of the defining themes of the entire case. The family photographs were real. The smiles were real. The children were genuinely loved by grandparents, relatives, and friends. At the same time, documented evidence showed that serious difficulties existed beneath the surface. Both realities could exist simultaneously. That duality challenged many assumptions people held about how family tragedies unfold. There was no obvious public collapse. No widely known history of domestic violence reported before the murders. No neighborhood arguments that drew police attention. Instead, investigators found a family managing ordinary responsibilities while privately confronting problems that outsiders could not fully see. During the summer of 2018, Shanann traveled to North Carolina with the children for several weeks to visit relatives. Chris remained in Colorado because of work. The time apart would later become significant during the investigation, as detectives reconstructed communications between the couple during that period. Messages showed Shanann expressing concern about changes she perceived in Chris's behavior. She sought reassurance about the future of their marriage, attempting to understand what had shifted between them. Those exchanges would later be examined carefully, not because they predicted violence, but because they documented a relationship experiencing genuine strain. By early August, Shanann left North Carolina and traveled to Arizona for a business conference related to her work. Friends who attended the event later described spending time with her during the trip, discussing work, family, and her pregnancy. Nothing about those interactions suggested that they believed they were seeing her for the final time. Late on the night of August 12, 2018, after her flight returned to Colorado, a friend drove Shanann home. Security footage from the neighborhood would later confirm her arrival shortly before 2 o'clock in the morning. It was the last verified recording of Shanann Watts alive. Within only a few hours, the quiet neighborhood of Saratoga Trail would awaken to another ordinary Monday. The families nearby would begin preparing for work. Children would start another week of summer activities. Cars would leave driveways one by one. No one could have imagined that behind the front door of one house, the course of 4 lives had already changed forever. By every outward measure, the Watts family looked like they were building the life they had always wanted. Theirs was not a story that began with public chaos or constant conflict. There were no flashing police lights outside the house, no neighbors recalling explosive arguments spilling into the street, and no long record of domestic disturbances that hinted at an inevitable tragedy. Instead, their lives appeared to follow the familiar rhythm shared by thousands of young families across suburban America: busy schedules, mortgage payments, children's activities, work commitments, and the endless balancing act of trying to create a better future. To understand why this case left such a lasting impact, it is important to understand who these people were before they became names in news headlines. Long before investigators arrived at Saratoga Trail, Chris and Shanann had been 2 individuals whose lives had followed very different paths before eventually intersecting. Shanann was born in North Carolina and grew up surrounded by a close-knit family. Friends and relatives would later describe her as determined, outgoing, and deeply resilient. She had experienced significant health challenges during adulthood and spoke openly about them, refusing to allow those experiences to define her. Instead, she often shared her journey publicly, encouraging others facing similar struggles. Whether speaking with friends or connecting with people online, she projected optimism and an unwavering belief that difficult circumstances could be overcome through persistence and hard work. That optimism became part of her identity. It influenced not only her personal relationships but also the way she approached her career. She embraced opportunities that allowed her to interact with people, build communities, and celebrate milestones. Social media became an extension of that personality. Family moments, birthday celebrations, children's accomplishments, and everyday routines frequently appeared in photographs and short videos. For relatives living hundreds of miles away, those updates served as a digital family album, allowing them to watch Bella and CECE grow from afar. Chris, by comparison, occupied a quieter space. People who knew him often described him as reserved, soft-spoken, and methodical. He was known for keeping his emotions largely to himself. Rather than seeking the spotlight, he appeared more comfortable allowing others to lead conversations. Friends and co-workers recalled someone who generally avoided conflict and rarely drew attention. He maintained a reputation for reliability at work and, at least outwardly, appeared committed to providing for his family. When Chris and Shanann began their relationship, those contrasting personalities seemed to complement one another. She was expressive. He was reserved. She enjoyed sharing moments publicly. He appeared content standing just outside the center of attention. Many couples build successful relationships around similar differences, and for years there was little reason for outsiders to believe theirs would be any different. Marriage followed. Then came children. The family's priorities naturally shifted toward creating a stable home. The arrival of Bella transformed everyday routines into those familiar to first-time parents. Sleep schedules replaced quiet evenings. Toys gradually occupied living spaces. Milestones that might seem ordinary to outsiders, a first step, a first word, a birthday candle blown out with help from smiling parents, became cherished memories preserved through photographs and videos. Not long afterward, Cece joined the family, bringing her own distinct personality into the household. Family members would later remember the sisters as different in temperament but inseparable in affection. Bella was often described as thoughtful and observant, while Cece possessed an energetic curiosity that seemed to fill every room she entered. Their laughter became a constant presence inside the house on Saratoga Trail. Looking back through family videos now is an emotional experience. Not because they reveal hidden warnings, but because they capture moments that appeared entirely ordinary. Children running through hallways. Parents celebrating birthdays. Holiday decorations covering the living room. Simple evenings that no one imagined would one day become evidence of a life interrupted. Perhaps that is one reason these recordings resonate so deeply. They remind viewers that tragedy rarely announces itself in advance. Ordinary life simply continues until, without warning, it doesn't. The Watts home itself reflected the aspirations common among young families during that period. Purchased several years earlier, the large two-story residence represented both achievement and responsibility. Like many homeowners, Chris and Shanann carried the financial obligations that accompanied such a purchase. Mortgage payments, insurance, utilities, childcare, medical expenses, and everyday living costs required careful planning. Later financial records showed that the family had encountered significant economic challenges. Years before the murders, they had filed for bankruptcy protection, citing substantial debt. Although bankruptcy provided temporary relief, it did not erase every financial pressure. By 2018, the family continued working toward greater financial stability while managing the ordinary expenses associated with raising two young children and preparing for a third. Financial stress alone does not predict violent crime. Millions of families experience similar pressures without violence ever entering their homes. For investigators, however, understanding the family's financial situation provided important context rather than explanation. It formed one piece of a much larger picture that included personal relationships, changing circumstances, and documented decisions made in the weeks before the murders. Another important part of that picture involved work. Chris's position with Anadarko Petroleum required him to travel regularly between oil and gas facilities spread across northeastern Colorado. Many shifts began before sunrise, meaning early departures from home became part of his routine. The work demanded technical knowledge and consistency, qualities co-workers later associated with him. They generally described him as dependable and capable, someone who completed assigned tasks without attracting unnecessary attention. His work environment would later become critically important to the investigation for reasons no one could have anticipated. Shanann's professional life followed a very different path. Her work relied heavily on communication, networking, and maintaining relationships through online platforms. She traveled periodically for conferences and training events, where she connected with colleagues from across the country. These trips represented opportunities for both professional development and personal friendships. They also required periods of separation from Chris and the children, although family life typically resumed shortly after she returned home. By the summer of 2018, another source of excitement had entered the household. Shanann was pregnant. The couple had announced they were expecting a baby boy. Friends recalled conversations about names, future plans, and the anticipation surrounding the family's newest addition. Publicly, the pregnancy appeared to symbolize another hopeful chapter in their lives. Videos shared online reflected that excitement, preserving moments that would later become almost unbearable to revisit. Yet as investigators reconstructed the months leading to August, evidence revealed that important changes had begun occurring beneath the surface. During Shanann's extended visit to North Carolina earlier that summer, she and Chris spent several weeks apart because of his work schedule in Colorado. Distance often tests relationships, and the communications exchanged during that period became part of the investigative record. Messages later reviewed by detectives documented Shanann's growing concern that something had changed emotionally between them. She expressed confusion. She sought reassurance. She attempted to understand why the warmth she had previously experienced seemed to be fading. Those messages reflected the struggles of a marriage under pressure, not a prediction of homicide. Couples confront uncertainty for countless reasons, and most emerge without violence. Even so, those documented exchanges would later help investigators understand the emotional landscape in which later events unfolded. Around the same period, Chris had begun a relationship with a coworker. The existence of that relationship was established during the investigation and later acknowledged through evidence gathered by detectives. It became one of several factors investigators considered while examining possible motives. Rather than viewing it in isolation, they evaluated it alongside financial pressures, marital difficulties, digital communications, and Chris's actions before and after the murders. The investigation would ultimately show that the story unfolding inside the Watts household was far more complicated than the carefully curated image visible to the outside world. Still, it is important not to mistake complication for inevitability. Nothing in the documented record suggested that friends or family believed violence was imminent. They saw challenges. They saw marital strain. They saw uncertainty about the future. But they also saw a pregnant mother planning for another child, 2 young daughters continuing their daily routines, and a family still attempting to move forward. Life often looks unfinished because it is. People argue. They reconcile. They worry about money. They make plans for tomorrow. The Watts family was no different in that respect. That ordinary uncertainty is precisely what makes the ending so difficult to comprehend. By the second week of August 2018, Shanann prepared for another business trip, this time to Arizona. She left Colorado believing she would return home after only a few days. Friends accompanying her during the conference later described conversations about work, family, and the baby she was expecting. Like every trip before it, this one appeared temporary. No one around her had reason to believe it would become her final journey home. As the conference concluded and flights departed for Colorado, another ordinary weekend drew to a close. Back in Frederick, Chris continued his normal routine. The neighborhood settled into another quiet Sunday evening. Streetlights illuminated empty sidewalks. Porch lights flickered on one by one. Inside homes across Saratoga Trail, families prepared for another work week. Children were tucked into bed. Alarm clocks were set. Everything about the neighborhood suggested that Monday morning would arrive just as countless Mondays had before. It did. But for one family, Monday morning would not bring another ordinary beginning. It would become the final chapter of a life that, from the outside, had once seemed so reassuringly ordinary. As the final days before August 13th unfolded, nothing about the neighborhood suggested that it was on the edge of becoming the focus of international attention. Saratoga Trail continued to move at its familiar pace. Residents left for work before sunrise, returned in the evening, greeted one another from driveways, and settled into routines that had become almost automatic. Children laughed in nearby yards. Delivery trucks passed through the subdivision. Dogs barked behind backyard fences. It was a place built around predictability, where one day often looked much like the next. For investigators looking back later, that sense of normalcy became one of the most striking aspects of the case. There was no dramatic turning point visible to the people around the Watts family. No single public event that caused friends or neighbors to believe something catastrophic was about to happen. Instead, the warning signs that detectives would later identify were almost entirely private. Some existed in text messages. Some appeared in digital records. Others emerged only after interviews, forensic examinations, and countless hours spent reconstructing the family's final weeks together. At the time, however, those pieces remained scattered and incomplete. Chris continued reporting to work. Shanann continued planning for the future. Bella and CCE continued living the uncomplicated lives of very young children, unaware of the concerns occupying the adults around them. It is impossible to look at photographs from those final weeks without recognizing the difference between what the camera captured and what history would later reveal. The images themselves remain ordinary. A family gathered together. Children smiling. Parents posing for pictures. The expectation of another season, another holiday, another birthday. Photographs preserve only a fraction of reality. They freeze expressions but not emotions. They record where people stood, not what they were thinking. That distinction became especially important in this case because so much of the family's public identity existed through images shared online. After the murders, those images spread rapidly across television broadcasts, newspapers, documentaries, and digital platforms around the world. Viewers searched them repeatedly, hoping to discover evidence that had somehow been overlooked. Some believed they saw clues hidden in facial expressions or body language. Others reached entirely different conclusions. Investigators, however, approached the material differently. Rather than searching for symbolic meaning, they focused on verifiable evidence. Digital timestamps. Phone records. Location data. Witness interviews. Surveillance footage. Financial documents. Every conclusion would need to withstand legal scrutiny, not public speculation. That disciplined approach would ultimately allow detectives to separate emotion from evidence, a distinction that proved essential as the case rapidly evolved. By early August, Shanann traveled to Arizona to attend a business conference connected to her work. The trip lasted only a few days, but it placed hundreds of miles between her and her family. Friends who accompanied her later described a busy schedule filled with meetings, conversations, and professional events. Like many conferences, it offered opportunities to reconnect with colleagues, exchange ideas, and prepare for future goals. At the same time, Shanann remained in regular contact with people back home. She exchanged messages with friends. She communicated with Chris. She continued discussing plans for the baby she was expecting. Some of those conversations reflected concerns about her marriage, concerns that had grown during the weeks she had spent away in North Carolina earlier that summer. She expressed uncertainty and sought reassurance, hoping to understand changes she believed she was seeing in their relationship. Those communications would later become part of the investigative record. Not because they foretold violence, but because they documented a marriage experiencing genuine strain. Relationships can survive periods of uncertainty. Many do. Investigators never treated those messages as proof of what would happen next. Instead, they viewed them as part of a broader timeline showing the emotional circumstances surrounding the family during the weeks before the murders. Meanwhile, Chris continued working at Anadarko Petroleum. His duties required regular visits to remote oil and gas sites spread across Weld County. These locations were isolated, often surrounded by open land, connected by long gravel roads stretching away from residential neighborhoods. On most days, they represented nothing more than another workplace for employees responsible for maintaining equipment and monitoring production. In the days ahead, one of those remote locations would become central to the investigation. At the time, It was simply another assignment on an ordinary work schedule. As Sunday, August 12th, drew to a close, Shannon boarded her return flight to Colorado. Travel delays pushed her arrival later than expected. A close friend picked her up from the airport and drove her home. Security footage from a neighboring residence later confirmed that she arrived at the house on Saratoga Trail shortly before 2 o'clock in the morning on August 13th. The recording captured only a brief moment. A vehicle pulled into the driveway. Shannon gathered her belongings. She walked toward the front door. The house disappeared into silence once more. That brief recording would later carry extraordinary significance. It established one of the final confirmed moments in Shannon's life. What happened after she entered the house would become the focus of one of the most closely examined homicide investigations in recent American history. Inside, the rest of the neighborhood remained asleep. Streetlights illuminated quiet sidewalks. The air was still. No emergency sirens interrupted the darkness. No neighbors reported hearing disturbances that suggested unimaginable violence was unfolding only a few houses away. Morning approached slowly. Across Frederick, alarm clocks prepared to wake workers for another Monday. Coffee makers would soon begin brewing. School preparations, work commutes, and ordinary responsibilities waited just a few hours away. Nothing about the coming sunrise appeared unusual. Yet somewhere between Shannon's arrival home and the beginning of daylight, the future of the Watts family came to an irreversible end. The precise sequence of those final hours would later be reconstructed through a combination of Chris Watts' statements, physical evidence, digital records, surveillance footage, and forensic investigation. Detectives carefully compared every available source of information, recognizing that no single piece of evidence could tell the complete story on its own. That process would take time. But by the afternoon of August 13th, the investigation had already begun. Not because detectives suspected homicide. Because people who knew Shannon immediately recognized that something was wrong. She missed appointments. She stopped responding to calls and messages. Friends who knew her well understood that such behavior was entirely out of character. Those small departures from routine triggered a chain of events that would quickly transform concern into one of the most significant criminal investigations in Colorado's recent history. It is often said that every major case begins with a single unanswered question. In this case, the first question was remarkably simple. Where is Shannon? As the hours passed, that question expanded. Where are Bella and CECE? Why had no one heard from them? Why had Shannon left behind belongings she would normally have taken? And why did the explanations offered by the person closest to them seem increasingly difficult to reconcile with the evidence beginning to emerge? Those questions would soon draw detectives into a painstaking investigation that relied not on dramatic revelations, but on careful observation, methodical analysis, and the accumulation of small facts that gradually formed a devastating picture. The peaceful image of Saratoga Trail would never be the same again. Within days, television news vans would line the streets. Reporters would broadcast live from the sidewalk outside the Watts home. Neighbors who had once described the community as quiet and ordinary would struggle to understand how such a crime could have unfolded so close to their own front doors. For many of them, the most disturbing realization was not simply that violence had occurred. It was that nothing they had seen in the days before had prepared them for it. That is what made this tragedy feel so profoundly unsettling. It challenged the comforting belief that extraordinary crimes always leave obvious warnings behind. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they leave only fragments, small changes, private conversations, subtle shifts in behavior that reveal their meaning only after it is too late. Those fragments were about to become the foundation of an investigation that would expose the painful gap between appearance and reality. And with that, the quiet suburban world of Frederick, Colorado, gave way to a story that would no longer be about ordinary family life, but about the relentless search for truth. The next chapter begins not with answers, but with the people whose absence first made everyone realize that something was terribly, unmistakably wrong. Before her name appeared in police reports, courtroom documents, and news broadcasts across the world, Shannon Watts was a person with her own dreams, struggles, ambitions, and relationships. She was not simply the victim at the center of a devastating crime. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a mother, a wife, and a woman who spent much of her adult life trying to build something she believed would last. To understand the tragedy that unfolded in August 2018, it is necessary to look beyond the final moments of her life and return to the years before everything changed. Because Shannon's story did not begin with loss. It began with determination. She was born Shannon Catherine Rusek in North Carolina, where she grew up surrounded by family. Those who knew her described someone who was ambitious, expressive, and unwilling to quietly accept the obstacles placed in front of her. She was the type of person who believed problems could be solved with enough effort, enough persistence, and enough faith in the possibility of a better future. That determination would follow her through adulthood. Like many people, Shannon experienced moments when life did not unfold exactly as planned. She faced personal challenges, health difficulties, and the complicated responsibilities that come with adulthood. Yet those experiences became part of the story she told about herself, not as evidence of weakness, but as proof that people could rebuild. She often shared parts of her journey openly. In an era when many people carefully edit their public image, Shannon frequently used social media as a place to connect with others. Her posts were not limited to major celebrations. She shared everyday moments, family routines, personal reflections, and messages of encouragement. She built relationships with people she had never met face to face, creating a community around shared experiences and mutual support. For some people, social media is simply a collection of photographs. For Shannon, it became a way of reaching outward. It allowed her to maintain connections with friends and relatives across different states. It allowed distant family members to watch Bella and CECE grow. It allowed her to celebrate achievements, document memories, and present the life she was working hard to create. That digital presence would later become one of the most visible records of who she was. But a person is always larger than the images they leave behind. Behind the photographs was a woman managing the same challenges faced by countless parents every day. She worried about her children. She planned for the future. She tried to balance work and family. She wanted stability. She wanted happiness. She wanted her children to grow up feeling loved and secure. When Shannon met Chris Watts, their personalities appeared very different. Chris was quiet and reserved. Shannon was more outgoing and socially engaged. Friends and family observed a contrast between them, but differences often attract people. Where one person may hesitate, another may encourage. Where one person prefers silence, another brings energy into the room. In the early years of their relationship, those differences appeared to create balance. They eventually married and began building a life together. Their relationship moved into the familiar stages many couples experience. A shared home. Shared responsibilities. New routines. Plans for the future. Then came parenthood. The birth of Bella changed the shape of their lives. The arrival of a child transforms ordinary routines into something entirely new. Quiet mornings become carefully planned schedules. Simple outings require preparation. A parent's attention shifts from personal freedom toward responsibility for someone who depends on them completely. For Shannon, motherhood became one of the most important parts of her identity. She documented moments that many parents recognize instantly. A child's excitement over a birthday celebration. A funny expression captured at exactly the right moment. A small achievement that feels enormous because it belongs to your child. These were not extraordinary events. They were ordinary moments. But ordinary moments are often the ones people treasure most. When CECE was born, the family grew again. The two sisters became central figures in Shannon's world. Friends and relatives later remembered their personalities, their relationship with one another, and the joy they brought into family gatherings. Shannon frequently shared their childhood experiences online not because she believed they were extraordinary compared with other children, but because, to her, they mattered. A child's laughter matters. A child's curiosity matters. A child's small victories matter. Those moments represented the future she was building. In addition to raising 2 young daughters, Shannon pursued professional goals. She became involved with a health and wellness company, building a business that relied heavily on communication and networking. The work allowed her to connect with others while also creating flexibility around her responsibilities as a mother. Her career became another expression of her personality. It required confidence. It required organization. It required the ability to encourage and motivate people. Those qualities were visible in the way she interacted with customers, colleagues, friends, and family members. She was someone who liked to share progress. She celebrated achievements. She believed in improvement. That mindset shaped the way she approached many aspects of life. However, behind the positive messages and family photographs, the Watts household also faced challenges familiar to many families. The couple experienced financial difficulties. They carried significant expenses. They managed the demands of raising young children while preparing for another baby. These pressures created stress, but they were not unusual. Many families experience financial strain without it leading to tragedy. In Shannon's case, those challenges existed alongside her continued efforts to maintain a stable home. She continued making plans. She continued looking forward. And in 2018, she was preparing for another major chapter. A 3rd child. A baby boy. Nico. The pregnancy represented a new beginning. It was a future she and her family had begun imagining. There were preparations to make, decisions about the baby's arrival, and the excitement that naturally surrounds welcoming a new life. For Shannon, the future was not an abstract idea. It was something she could already picture. A larger family. 3 children growing together. More birthdays. More memories. More ordinary days that, at the time, seemed guaranteed. But while Shannon was planning that future, her marriage had entered a difficult period. During the months before the murders, evidence later revealed that she became increasingly concerned about changes in Chris's behavior. Their communications showed moments of uncertainty and emotional distance. Shannon attempted to understand what was happening between them and expressed concerns about the state of their relationship. Those messages would later become part of the investigation. They showed a woman trying to understand a relationship that no longer felt the same. They showed someone searching for reassurance. They showed someone who still believed there was a future worth fighting for. This is one of the most painful aspects of examining Shannon's story. The future she imagined was still alive in her mind. The plans she made were still real to her. The life she was trying to protect still mattered. She was not living inside a story that had already ended. She was living inside a story she believed was continuing. In early August 2018, Shannon traveled to Arizona for a business conference. During that trip, she spent time with friends and colleagues, participating in professional events and conversations. She returned to Colorado believing she was coming home to her family. She did not know that the home she was returning to would become the final place she was ever seen alive. She did not know that the photographs she had taken, the messages she had sent, and the memories she had created would soon become the only remaining pieces of a life that had been violently interrupted. To understand the impact of this case, it is not enough to know what happened to Shannon. It is necessary to remember who she was before it happened. A woman who loved her children. A woman who believed in building a better life. A woman who shared her struggles and achievements with others. A woman whose life was not defined by the final moments she experienced. The world would eventually know her because of the crime that took her life. But before that, she was known by the people who loved her simply as Shannon. And her story deserves to begin there. When people discuss crimes involving children, it is easy for the victims to become reduced to numbers in a report or names repeated during a trial. But Bella and Celeste Watts were not symbols. They were not simply evidence in a criminal case. They were 2 little girls with different personalities, favorite things, routines, and dreams that were only beginning to form. Before the headlines, before their photographs appeared on television screens across America, they were simply children growing up in a family home in Colorado. They woke up in the mornings expecting another day. They played. They laughed. They asked questions about the world around them. They depended on the adults in their lives to keep them safe. That expectation of safety is one of the most painful parts of their story. Children understand the world through trust. A parent's voice is reassurance. A familiar room is protection. A home is supposed to be the one place where fear cannot enter. For Bella and Celeste, their home on Saratoga Trail was exactly that. It was where their toys were kept. Where their birthdays were celebrated. Where they watched movies, played together, and created the small memories that define childhood. The house was not just a building. It was their entire world. Bella, the older sister, was born in 2013. Family members described her as a thoughtful and caring child who often showed a gentle nature toward others. At 4 years old, she was at an age when children begin developing stronger personalities and a clearer understanding of the world around them. She noticed things. She asked questions. She wanted to participate. Like many children her age, Bella was beginning to discover independence while still relying heavily on the people closest to her. She was learning new words. Learning new skills. Learning what it meant to be part of a family. Photographs and videos shared by Shanann showed moments familiar to many parents. Bella smiling during family activities. Bella interacting with her younger sister. Bella participating in celebrations. These moments were not unusual, and that was exactly what made them meaningful. Childhood is often made of small moments. A game played in the living room. A conversation before bedtime. A favorite snack. A silly joke that only makes sense to a child. These tiny pieces of daily life become the memories families carry for years. Celeste, known affectionately as CECE, was born in 2015. She was younger than Bella and was often remembered as energetic, expressive, and full of personality. Where Bella was described as more thoughtful and observant, CECE was often seen as the more openly adventurous child. She brought a different energy into the family dynamic. Together, the sisters created the kind of relationship many siblings share, a mixture of affection, playfulness, and the occasional disagreements that come with growing up side by side. Their differences did not separate them. They made them unique. Family videos showed the sisters engaging in everyday childhood experiences. They played together. They celebrated holidays. They interacted with their parents. They experienced the world with the curiosity that belongs only to young children. For viewers who later encountered these recordings after the murders, those moments carried a heartbreaking weight. But before tragedy changed their meaning, they were simply memories. A mother recording her daughters because she wanted to remember them growing up. A family capturing moments because they believed there would be thousands more. That belief is something nearly every parent understands. People rarely record the last ordinary day. They record because they assume life will continue. They assume there will always be another birthday, another vacation, another family photograph, another chance to create a new memory. The Watts family was no different. The children were part of the future Shanann imagined. The arrival of their baby brother, Nico, was supposed to expand that future. Bella and Celeste were preparing to become older sisters. Like many young children expecting a new sibling, they were entering a period of excitement and adjustment. A new baby meant a changing family structure. It meant new responsibilities, new experiences, and a new person they would grow up beside. That future never arrived. But before that loss, there was anticipation. There were plans. There was hope. The tragedy of Bella and Celeste is especially difficult to comprehend because of how young they were. They had experienced so little of life. Their personalities were still developing. Their interests were still changing. Their dreams had not yet had the opportunity to fully form. They had not reached school age. They had not discovered their future passions. They had not experienced friendships, achievements, challenges, and successes that come with growing older. Their lives ended before they had the chance to discover who they would become. In the aftermath of the murders, Many people around the world connected deeply with the girls because they represented something universally recognizable: childhood itself. The excitement of a child learning something new. The innocence of believing adults can solve every problem. The comfort of knowing someone will always be there. That innocence makes crimes against children particularly devastating because children do not possess the ability to understand betrayal in the same way adults do. They rely completely on the people responsible for their protection. Bella and CECE trusted their parents. That trust was absolute. And that reality became one of the most painful elements of the investigation. As detectives reconstructed the final days of the Watts family, they also had to confront the responsibility of telling the story of two children who could no longer speak for themselves. Their rooms. Their belongings. Their photographs. Their recorded voices. All became reminders that behind every piece of evidence was a real child. A child with a family who loved her. A child who had favorite moments. A child who mattered. In the months and years following the crime, relatives and supporters continued honoring Bella and Celeste's memory. Their names became associated not only with the tragedy that took them, but also with the importance of remembering victims as complete human beings rather than only as parts of a criminal investigation. Because a victim's story should not begin at the moment of death. It should begin with life. For Bella and Celeste, that life was brief, but it was not meaningless. They were loved. They were celebrated. They were remembered. Their photographs showed two young girls smiling, playing, and experiencing the world around them. Those images became a reminder of everything that was taken away not just from them, but from everyone who imagined the future they should have had. There should have been more birthdays. More school pictures. More family vacations. More moments of watching them grow. There should have been ordinary days. And ordinary days are often the greatest gift. The tragedy of the Watts case is not only that 3 people were killed. It is that 3 futures disappeared. For Bella, there should have been years of discovering who she would become. For Celeste, there should have been years of laughter, learning, and growing alongside her sister. For Nico, there should have been a first breath, a first step, a first word, and a lifetime of experiences waiting ahead. Their absence is measured not only by what happened in August 2018. It is measured by every moment afterward that never happened. Every birthday that passed. Every holiday that arrived. Every milestone that remained empty. When the world remembers the Watts case, it is important that Bella and Celeste are remembered not only as victims of a terrible crime. They were daughters. They were sisters. They were children. They were 2 young lives that once filled a home with laughter and energy. And before the investigation began, before detectives searched for answers, before courtrooms and headlines took over the story, they were simply Bella and Cece, 2 little girls who deserved the chance to grow up. In the months leading up to August 2018, the Watts family was standing at the edge of what appeared to be another beginning. The arrival of a new baby was supposed to transform their household once again. A new crib. New preparations. New routines. Another child joining 2 older sisters who were still young enough to experience the excitement of becoming big sisters for the first time. The baby had already become part of the family's future. His name was Nico. Although he would never take his first breath, never open his eyes, and never experience the world his family imagined for him, his presence was real. He existed in his mother's plans, in conversations with loved ones, and in the hopes of a family preparing for his arrival. For Shan-An, pregnancy was not only about adding another child to the household. It represented another chapter in the life she had spent years building. She had already experienced the transformation of becoming a mother twice. She knew the sleepless nights, the endless responsibilities, the worries that came with protecting a child. She knew the overwhelming feeling of watching a tiny person slowly discover the world. And now she was preparing to do it again. A family of 4 was becoming a family of 5. That was the future she believed was waiting for her. During the summer of 2018, Shan-An shared moments of that anticipation publicly. Photographs and videos documented her pregnancy, her daughter's excitement, and the family's preparations. To outsiders, These images showed a household moving forward. A mother expecting a son. Two young girls preparing for a new role. Parents preparing for another stage of life. The ordinary hopes of an ordinary family. That is what makes the loss so difficult to understand. The future is invisible. People cannot see the birthdays that have not happened. They cannot see the first day of school that has not arrived. They cannot see the conversations that will never take place. When a life ends, the world loses not only what existed, but everything that was supposed to come next. For the Watts family, that unwritten future was enormous. Bella and Celeste would never grow up together. They would never become teenagers. They would never experience the complicated, wonderful process of discovering who they were becoming. Nico would never meet his sisters. He would never know the sound of his mother's voice. He would never experience the simple moments that define a childhood. Those missing moments are difficult to measure because they are not recorded in documents or evidence files. They exist only in imagination. Yet they are part of understanding the true impact of the crime. Every investigation has evidence. Photographs. Reports. Statements. Records. But behind those materials are human lives. And human lives are made of moments. For Sharn-Ann, many of those moments were connected to motherhood. She documented her daughters' personalities. She celebrated their achievements. She shared their growth with relatives and friends. She created memories because she believed there would always be more. Parents often do this instinctively. They take pictures of a child sleeping because they want to remember that moment. They record a child's laughter because they know childhood moves quickly. They save drawings and small objects because they represent stages of life that cannot be repeated. Those objects may seem ordinary at the time. Years later, they become priceless. Inside the Watts home were countless reminders of a family still in progress. Children's belongings. Family photographs. Items prepared for the arrival of another baby. Evidence of a life that had not reached its conclusion. A home is often a collection of future plans. A child's room is not only a room. It represents the years that parents expect to unfold there. A calendar filled with appointments is not just a schedule. It is a promise that tomorrow will arrive. The tragedy at Saratoga Trail destroyed those expectations. But before that happened, the family had already created a story filled with ordinary love. That is important to remember because the aftermath of a crime can sometimes overshadow everything that came before it. Headlines focus on the final event. Courtrooms focus on evidence. Investigations focus on timelines. But families are not defined by their worst day. They are defined by all the days before it. For Sharn-Ann, those days included raising two daughters, building friendships, pursuing professional goals, and preparing for another child. For Bella and CECE, those days included playing, learning, laughing, and growing. For Nico, those days existed only as a future his family imagined. One of the most painful realities of this case is that the victims had no opportunity to write the next chapters of their own stories. Their identities became permanently connected to a crime they did not choose. That is why remembering their lives matters. Because the most important question is not only, what happened to them? It is also, who were they before it happened? Sharn-Ann was a woman who wanted to create stability and happiness for her family. Bella was a young girl discovering the world around her. Celeste was a child whose energy and personality brought joy to those who knew her. Nico was a baby whose entire life existed in the hopes of the people waiting for him. They were not characters in a criminal case. They were people whose lives had meaning before tragedy interrupted them. The public often searches for a reason when confronted with something unimaginable. People want an explanation that makes the world feel predictable again. If there was a warning sign, perhaps the tragedy could be understood. If there was an obvious cause, perhaps similar events could be prevented. But some cases resist simple explanations. The Watts case remains disturbing because it involved people who appeared ordinary. A family home. A suburban neighborhood. A father. A mother. Children. The setting was familiar. The loss was unimaginable. And that contrast continues to affect everyone who studies the case. As investigators would later uncover, the final days of the Watts family's life together were filled with unanswered questions and hidden tensions. But before the investigation revealed those details, there was something much simpler. There was a family. There was a mother preparing for a baby. There were two sisters waiting for a brother. There were people who believed they would have more time. Time is something people rarely notice while they have it. A normal evening feels like it will repeat forever. A child's laugh feels like a sound that will always exist somewhere in the house. A family photograph feels like one of many. No one knows which moment will become the last. That is why the story of the Watts family cannot begin with the crime. It must begin with the lives that were taken. Because before the investigation, before the courtroom, before the world knew their names, Sean and Bella, Celeste, and Nico were simply a family looking toward the future. A future they would never reach. August the 12th, 2018, began like many other Sundays in suburban America. The weekend was coming to an end. Across Colorado, families were preparing for another week of work, school, appointments, and routines. Grocery lists were being completed. Clothes were being prepared for Monday morning. Alarm clocks were being set. In Frederick, Colorado, the Watts family home on Saratoga Trail appeared quiet from the outside. But inside that house, the final hours of the family's story were unfolding. For Shannon Watts, August 12th was the end of a journey home. She had spent several days in Arizona attending a business conference connected to her work. The trip had been an opportunity to meet with colleagues, participate in professional activities, and spend time away from the everyday responsibilities of raising young children. During the trip, she remained connected to her family. She communicated with friends. She stayed in contact with people close to her. She continued thinking about the life waiting for her back in Colorado. At the time, returning home likely felt like the beginning of another ordinary week. There were still plans ahead. There was still a baby on the way. There were still two little girls waiting to see their mother. The flight home was delayed, and by the time Shannon arrived back in Colorado, it was late. A friend picked her up from the airport and drove her toward Frederick. The streets were quieter than they had been earlier in the day. The usual movement of commuters and families had faded. Porch lights illuminated driveways. Most homes had already settled into the stillness of nighttime. Shortly before 2 a.m. on August 13th, security footage from a neighboring residence captured Sean and arriving at her home on Saratoga Trail. It was a brief moment. A vehicle pulling into the driveway. A woman returning after traveling. A normal arrival at the end of a long day. There was nothing in that image to suggest what would soon become known. For Shannon, this was not the end of something. It was supposed to be a return. A return to her husband. A return to her daughters. A return to the home where she expected her life to continue. Inside the house were the familiar details of family life. The rooms where her children played. The belongings accumulated over years. The preparations for a new baby. The objects that represented ordinary routines. Those details would later become part of a crime scene investigation, but at that moment they were simply pieces of a home. A home where a family had lived. A home where memories had been created. A home where tomorrow was supposed to arrive. The hours between Shannon's arrival and sunrise remain the most crucial and tragic period of the case. According to Chris Watts' later confessions, he was responsible for the deaths of Shannon and their daughters during that early morning period. His accounts changed during multiple interviews, and investigators compared each version against physical evidence and forensic findings to establish the timeline. The details of those final moments became central to the investigation and later court proceedings. What is known is that sometime after Shannon returned home, the lives of the 4 members of the Watts family still inside the house came to an end. The person responsible was not an unknown outsider. It was the man who lived there. The husband. The father. The person expected to provide protection and safety. That reality became one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Many violent crimes create an immediate separation between victim and offender. A stranger enters. A threat appears from outside. The danger is external. The Watts case presented a different and more unsettling reality. The danger came from within the family structure itself. The investigation later revealed that Chris Watts had been involved in a relationship with a co-worker and had been considering a future separate from Sharnan. Detectives examined this relationship, along with financial issues and marital problems, as part of their investigation into possible motives. But motives are often complicated. They are built from circumstances, choices, emotions, and decisions. A motive may explain what investigators believe influenced a person. It does not justify the action. Nothing about relationship problems, financial stress, or personal dissatisfaction can explain away the loss of innocent lives. Especially the lives of children. As the night moved toward morning, the neighborhood remained unaware. The houses around Saratoga Trail stood peacefully beneath the Colorado sky. Neighbors slept. Cars remained parked in driveways. The world outside continued exactly as it had the night before. That contrast between ordinary surroundings and extraordinary tragedy would become a defining feature of the case. The scene was not an abandoned building. It was not a remote location. It was a family neighborhood. A place where people expected safety. A place where children played outside. A place where residents knew one another by sight. The first light of August 13th arrived quietly. And with it came the beginning of a chain of events that would transform a missing person report into a national investigation. But before detectives arrived, before cameras gathered outside the home, before the public knew the name Chris Watts, there was simply a family that had disappeared. A mother who did not respond. 2 children who were missing. A house that no longer felt normal. The first person to realize something was wrong was not a detective. It was a friend. Someone who knew Sharnan well enough to recognize that silence was unusual. Because Sharnan was not someone who simply vanished from communication. She had responsibilities. She had appointments. She had people expecting to hear from her. When messages went unanswered and plans were missed, concern quickly replaced curiosity. At first, those around her hoped for a simple explanation. Perhaps her phone was unavailable. Perhaps something unexpected had happened. Perhaps she needed time to rest after traveling. But as hours passed, the situation became increasingly alarming. The small details of an ordinary morning began creating a disturbing picture. A missing person. A missing mother. 2 missing children. And a husband whose answers would soon be examined under intense scrutiny. The Watts home, which only hours earlier represented family life and future plans, was about to become the center of a desperate search for the truth. The investigation had not yet uncovered what happened. The public did not yet know what investigators would discover. But the first question had already arrived. Where was Sharnan Watts? And where were Bella and Celeste? The morning of August 13th, 2018, began with uncertainty. At first, there was no crime scene. No police investigation. No national attention. There was only a growing feeling among the people closest to Sharnan Watts that something was wrong. A person had stopped responding. Plans had been missed. Messages had gone unanswered. And for those who knew Sharnan well, that silence was impossible to ignore. Sharnan was someone who maintained regular contact with the people around her. Between her family, friends, business connections, and responsibilities as a mother, communication was a normal part of her daily life. She was not someone who would casually disappear without explanation. That morning, the absence of ordinary things became the first warning sign. No phone calls returned. No messages answered. No confirmation that she had arrived safely after her late-night flight home. At first, concern remained mixed with hope. There are moments when people instinctively search for harmless explanations. Maybe she was sleeping. Maybe her phone had died. Maybe travel exhaustion had caused her to change her plans. Maybe there was a simple reason. The mind often tries to protect itself from the worst possibility. Especially when children are involved. But as the hours passed, the situation became increasingly unusual. A close friend of Shannon's became worried enough to take action. The friend knew Shannon's routine, knew she had important commitments, and understood that something about the situation did not match her normal behavior. Eventually, the concern became serious enough that authorities were contacted. That decision would begin one of the most closely watched criminal investigations in modern American history. When officers arrived at the Watts home on Saratoga Trail, they were responding to what appeared to be a missing person case. The first priority was finding Shannon and her children. At that stage, investigators did not know what had happened. They did not know whether the family had left voluntarily. They did not know whether there had been an accident. They did not know whether someone else was involved. Every possibility had to be considered. The house itself provided the first environment where investigators searched for answers. Inside, they encountered a scene that did not immediately resemble a typical disappearance. Important personal belongings remained behind. The family vehicle was present. The children's belongings were still in the home. There were no obvious signs that the family had packed for a trip or planned to leave. Those details began creating questions. When someone leaves voluntarily, they often take items they need. Clothing, phones, personal possessions, medication, essential documents. But the Watts home contained signs of a life interrupted rather than a life intentionally abandoned. Investigators also noticed details that would later become significant. Shannon's phone was located. Her wedding ring was discovered. The family dog, Dieter, was present. The children's car seats remained in place. The home looked like a family had gone to sleep and expected to wake up to another normal day. Except they never did. As officers continued examining the situation, Chris Watts became the central person they needed to speak with. He was the husband, the father, the person who had been inside the home during the critical hours before the disappearance. At this point, investigators were still gathering information. Speaking with family members. Understanding timelines. Determining what happened and when. Chris cooperated with officers and allowed them into the home. He answered questions about his wife and children. He described what he claimed had happened that morning and explained his version of events. According to Chris, he had left for work early that morning. He said he and Shannon had a difficult conversation before he left, and he later claimed that he believed she had taken the children and left. But investigators found parts of his account difficult to reconcile. The timeline raised questions. Certain details did not fit naturally with the physical evidence. The absence of the children. The lack of belongings taken from the home. The circumstances surrounding Shannon's disappearance. Each detail became another piece requiring examination. At the same time, the case began attracting attention beyond the immediate neighborhood. When a pregnant woman and 2 young children disappear, public concern spreads quickly. Neighbors gathered outside. News crews began arriving. People who had never met the Watts family learned their names. The search for answers became public. Chris himself appeared on television, asking for information and pleading for the safe return of his family. Standing outside the house, he spoke about wanting his wife and children to come home. To many viewers, the situation was heartbreaking. A father appeared to be searching for his missing family. A husband appeared to be asking for help. But investigators watching the interview were not only listening to his words. They were observing. They were comparing. They were looking for consistency between what was being said publicly and what evidence was beginning to reveal privately. In criminal investigations, interviews are not simply conversations. They are opportunities to establish timelines, to compare statements, to identify contradictions, to understand behavior. Detectives are trained to notice details that ordinary observers might overlook. A pause before answering. A change in wording. An explanation that requires additional explanations. None of these things alone proves guilt. But when combined with physical evidence, they can become significant. As the day continued, investigators began receiving assistance from people who knew the family. Neighbors provided information. Friends shared concerns. Surveillance footage from nearby homes became increasingly important. One neighbor, who had a security camera system, provided footage that would later become a crucial piece of evidence. The recording showed Chris's truck leaving the driveway during the early morning hours. At first glance, it was simply a vehicle leaving a home. But investigators knew that timing mattered. Every minute mattered. The question was not only where the truck went. The question was what happened before it left. And what was inside. The investigation was still young. The answers were not yet complete. But the direction was beginning to change. What started as a search for a missing mother and 2 children was slowly becoming something much darker. The possibility that the family had not disappeared voluntarily became harder to ignore. Meanwhile, the people who loved Shannon continued hoping. Friends searched for information. Relatives waited for news. The community prayed for a safe return. Many people watching from outside experienced the same emotional journey. First came concern. Then confusion. Then fear. Because every hour without answers created another painful possibility. The case had not yet reached the moment when the truth would be revealed. But the foundation of the investigation was already being built. A missing family. A quiet suburban home. A husband whose story would be examined piece by piece. And evidence beginning to suggest that the most important answers might not be found by looking for someone outside the house. They might be found by looking at the person who was already there. As investigators continued reconstructing the morning of August 13, 2018, one element became increasingly important: the timeline. In any missing person investigation, time is often the first great mystery. When was the person last seen? Who saw them? Where were they? What happened during the hours when no one else was watching? For the Watts case, those questions centered around the early morning hours inside a quiet suburban home in Frederick, Colorado. The timeline was not built from a single source. It came together through multiple pieces of information: surveillance footage, phone records, statements from Chris Watts, workplace records, and forensic evidence gathered during the investigation. Each piece alone told only a small part of the story. Together, they revealed a sequence of events that would eventually lead investigators away from the idea of a missing family and toward the reality of a homicide. The first known movement came from a camera positioned near the Watts residence. The footage captured Chris Watts' work truck leaving the driveway in the early morning darkness. To a casual observer, it might have appeared completely ordinary. A worker leaving early for a job. A man beginning another workday. In many neighborhoods, vehicles leave before sunrise every morning. People commute. Employees begin shifts. Life starts early. But investigators viewed the footage differently. They were not watching a normal morning. They were examining the final known hours of 3 missing children and their pregnant mother. The question was not simply why Chris left. The question was what happened before he left. And what happened after. As detectives reviewed the footage, they noticed details that became significant within the larger investigation. The vehicle was positioned in a way that allowed investigators to examine Chris's movements more closely. The timing of his departure became another important point in establishing the sequence of events. Meanwhile, Chris continued telling investigators that he did not know where his family had gone. The contrast between his statements and the emerging evidence became increasingly difficult to ignore. In the early stages of an investigation, detectives must consider multiple possibilities. A family member may leave voluntarily. A person may be harmed by someone unknown. An accident may have occurred. A misunderstanding may exist. Investigators cannot simply assume the worst. But they also cannot ignore contradictions. As the hours passed, more questions emerged. Why were Shannon's belongings still inside the home? Why were the children's possessions still present? Why did the house appear as though the family had never planned to leave? Why did certain details fail to match the idea of a voluntary disappearance? Each question narrowed the possibilities. The search for answers also expanded beyond the house itself. Investigators examined digital information. Modern investigations often depend heavily on technology because phones and online activity create a record of daily life. Calls, messages, location information, and electronic devices can help establish where people were and what they were doing. In the Watts case, digital evidence became an important part of understanding the relationship between Chris and Sharnan during the weeks leading up to the disappearance. It also helped investigators examine the timeline of the final day. But evidence does not always arrive with immediate clarity. A message may reveal concern but not intent. A phone record may establish contact but not meaning. A financial record may show pressure but not motive. Detectives had to consider every piece carefully. They were not trying to create a story. They were trying to discover the truth. Outside the home, the neighborhood began changing. The quiet streets of Saratoga Trail became filled with activity. Police vehicles arrived. Investigators moved in and out of the residence. Neighbors watched from a distance, trying to understand how a family they recognized could suddenly become the center of a major investigation. Many residents later described the feeling of disbelief. The Watts home had been ordinary. The street had been ordinary. The community had been ordinary. That was part of what made the situation so disturbing. People often imagine serious crimes happening somewhere else. In unfamiliar places. To unfamiliar people. The reality that it could happen inside a familiar neighborhood creates a different kind of fear. The investigation also began receiving attention from the media. The disappearance of a pregnant woman and 2 young children naturally attracted public concern. News organizations began covering the search, and images of the family spread across the country. The public saw photographs of Sharnan, Bella, and Celeste. They saw a family that appeared happy. They heard Chris asking for their return. They watched the search unfold. At this stage, many people hoped for a positive outcome. Missing person cases often begin with uncertainty, and uncertainty allows room for hope. Families hold on to the possibility that someone will walk through the door. Friends imagine receiving a phone call. Communities organize searches. People pray for good news. But behind the scenes, investigators were moving quickly. They were not only searching for missing people. They were testing a timeline. And timelines have a way of exposing inconsistencies. One of the most important questions involved Chris's workplace. He had told investigators he went to a remote oil site after leaving home. That location would later become a major focus of the investigation. At first, it was simply where Chris worked. A place connected to his daily responsibilities. But investigators began asking why he had gone there that morning. What happened there? Why was that location important? As detectives continued gathering information, they also examined Chris's behavior after the disappearance. He appeared publicly concerned. He cooperated with authorities. He spoke about wanting his family back. But investigators understood that outward behavior could not replace evidence. A person could appear calm and still be truthful. A person could appear emotional and still be deceptive. Behavior alone was not enough. The facts had to decide. The turning point was approaching. Not because of one dramatic discovery, but because several smaller pieces of evidence were beginning to align. The missing family. The timeline. The surveillance footage. The unanswered questions. The inconsistencies. The remote work location. Together, they created a growing pressure that Chris's original explanation could not withstand. By the end of the first day, the Watts case had already moved beyond a simple disappearance. Investigators were facing the possibility that the family had not left the home willingly. And if that was true, then the person who knew the most about what happened was likely not a stranger. It was the person who had been closest to them. The man who shared their home. The man who was supposed to be searching alongside everyone else. Chris Watts. The investigation was entering a new phase. The search for a missing family was becoming a search for the truth. And the truth was waiting in places no one initially expected to look.